Hello and welcome back to FAD Learning. In our previous sessions, we covered the fundamental building blocks of Angular, including components, data bindings, directives, and also we covered signals and linked signals. Now let's dive into another building block of Angular, routing. And as you know, Angular is a single page application framework, but we can still achieve multi-page navigation using routing, and this allows us to navigate between multiple components while running a single index.html file. Therefore, as an Angular developer, we must know about routing. So in this video, we will understand how to configure normal routes, default routes, and wildcard routes. And we will also cover the importance of router outlet directive and explore how to redirect between components using the href attribute as well as router link directive. So let's open Visual Studio Code and start with the root component. And as we know, the app component is the root component of any Angular application. And we can create multiple components under the app component using the CLI command ng-generate component name. So far we have created multiple components like attribute directives, data binding directives, signals, structural directives, etc. But to render each component on the web, we have added the component selector in the app.component.html file here. But in a real world project, this approach is not feasible because Angular is a component based framework and we often need to redirect from one component to another. And to achieve this, we need to use routing. So to demonstrate routing, let's create a navbar. And since we have already installed the Bootstrap, we will use Bootstrap navbar. Let me comment out this attribute directive component first. And now let me open browser and here I'll search Bootstrap 5.3 navbar. And here let me copy this first example, copy to clipboard, and I'll paste it into the app.component.html file. So here instead of this selector, I'll paste the navbar code. And now I'll make some modifications to the navbar code. Like here, I'll comment out the first. You comment out this anchor as well. Also, I'll comment out this drop down. And here, instead of link, I'll write user. And I'll add few more li here. This li is for data binding. This li is for structural directive. And this is for attribute directive. Now save the changes and let me open browser. And here you can see the navbar is displayed. I'll update the background color. Instead of tertiary, I'll write secondary, which should improve the appearance of navbar. Save the changes and now you can see it looks good. Now when I click on this link, or if I type a component URL here like user, I want to navigate to the corresponding component, and to achieve this we will utilize Angular routing feature. So now let's understand how to add routing to an Angular application. Let's go back to Visual Studio Code, and here we have an index.html file with a base href tag, which is automatically generated when we create an Angular application. And the href attribute specifies the base URL for all relative URLs on a page. So during navigation, the Angular router uses the base href tag as a base path to the component. Therefore, without this base href tag, routing won't work. And when we created our Angular application, we were asked, would you like to add Angular routing? Since we said yes, we don't need to install any third-party packages to implement routing, because routing is a library included in Angular by default when creating a new project. And as a result, we have a file called app.routes.ts. And prior to Angular 16, this file was a module, but now it's a normal constant TypeScript file. So here we have an empty routes array created with the database routes. And this routes allows us to map a specific URL to a particular component, enabling us to access that component through a unique URL, such as a route defines the URL path that corresponds to a specific component. So now let's create route. And a route is an object that consists of two parameters. First parameter is path, and this is the URL path for your component. And it can be any name. For example, I'll write user for the user component. And second parameter is component. And this parameter specifies which component to render when the path is accessed. We need to provide the component class name here. And in our case, for the user path, I'll write user component. Okay. So this is how we can create routes in Angular. I repeat, a route is an object, and within that object, we have two parameters, path and component. And path refers to the link for your component, which can be any name. For example, we have created a user component. That is why I have set its path to user. And second parameter is component. This specifies which component to render when this user path is accessed. So in this case, when a user accesses the user path, it means they want to be redirected to the user component. Okay. So like this, we can add multiple route objects as needed. So here, let me add three more routes. One is for data binding component. And for this path, I want to redirect to data binding component. And next path is for structural directive. For this path, I want to redirect to structural directive component. And last, I'll add attribute directive. And for this, I want to redirect to attribute directive component. Okay. So this is how we can configure the normal routes in Angular. But simply defining a route does not render the corresponding component on the web when we type the URL or click the navbar link. This is because Angular requires the router outlet directive in our template to serve as a placeholder where the router will render the component associated with the current route. So here after this navbar, let me add router outlet. And starting from Angular 17, it's compulsory to import router outlet in our modules imports array. So let me uncomment this and now save the changes. And here you can see on the browser the user components rendered along with the navbar. Okay, so what is routing? Routing enables navigation or redirection from one component to another. And what is router outlet? Router outlet is a directive or it is a placeholder where the router renders the component associated with the current route. Especially, it is a container where Angular displays the component corresponding to the current URL. Let's try another URL. Like here, instead of user, I'll write data binding. And here you can see the data binding component rendered on the web. Similarly, let me copy paste the next path, that is structural directive. So here instead of data binding, let me paste structural directive, and here you can see the component of structural directive rendered on web. And last, attribute directive. Enter. And we can see the attribute directive component also on web along with navbar. Now let me open the developer tool. Let me clear the console. And if I reload the browser on localhost 4200 or enter an incorrect path, like instead of user, I'll write users and hit enter. You can see I get a 404 error. This is because we haven't handled empty routes and wildcard routes yet. So let's configure an empty routes first. And empty routes is also called as default route, which means that when no URL is specified, a default route determines which component to render on the web. And the default route must be defined as the first object in the routes array. And there are two ways to define a default route. First way is similar to a normal route but with empty path. So here path equals to empty string, comma, second parameter component. And for this component parameter, we need to specify the component name that Angular will render when the empty path is accessed. So here, if the path is empty, I'd like to render on user component. Okay, so this configuration tells Angular to render the user component when the empty path is accessed. Let me save this and let me test in the browser. If I delete this and if I reload this browser on localhost 4200, now you can see the user component has rendered on browser. Now let's understand the second way to define the default route with three parameters. So let me comment out this first way, and below this I'll add the second object. And as I said, this second way is contain three parameters. First parameter is path, and this will be an empty string, comma, and second parameter is redirect to. This parameter specifies the URL path to redirect to when no URL is provided. And here you can see, starting from Angular 18, the redirect to parameter accepts two types of values. First is string and second is redirect function. String type value means the component path where you want to redirect your application. And redirect function means this allows us to write an arrow function that specifies a conditional statement to determine the redirect path. And the redirect occurs only if the condition returns true, otherwise no redirect happens. But prior to Angular 18, only string type value were supported for the redirect to parameter. So as of now, I'll go with string type value, and here I'll pass user path. Now third parameter, we need to add path match. And this parameter specifies how the router matches URLs to routes, controlling whether the match is exact or prefix based. And again, it has two possible values. One is full, means the router only matches the route if the entire URL matches the route path. And second is prefix, means the router matches the route if the URL starts with the route. So in this case, we use path match full to ensure the router only matches the default route when the entire URL is empty. Now let's check the application in the browser, and let me reload this application on 4200. And this time also you can see, instead of throwing an error, the application redirects to the user component. Okay, so this is the purpose of default route. But what if someone enters an incorrect URL? Like here, instead of user, I write users and hit enter. In this case, we are still getting an error. And to handle such routes, we use something called wildcard routes. So now let's configure the wildcard routes. So what is the purpose of wildcard route? Wildcard routes handle the URLs that are not defined in an application. And when the router encounters an unrecognized URL, it can redirect to a specified component. For example, a wildcard route can navigate to a 404 page for any invalid route. So to demonstrate this, I'll create a new component called page not found. ng generate component page not found component. And inside HTML file, I'll add 404 page not found message. Div.textCenter, and inside this div, I'll take h3 and I'll add message 404 page not found. Save the changes and let's add the route for invalid URL. And note that the wildcard routes must be defined as the last object in the routes configuration. Default route must be the first object and wildcard route must be the last object in the routes configuration. And similar to normal routes, this object also contains two parameters. First is path, and this path specified as 2 asterisks to match every route. And second parameter component specified as page not found component. So save the changes and let's retest this scenario by typing an incorrect URL. So here instead of user, I'll write users, and here you can see this time we are redirected to the page not found component with 404 page not found message. And if I type a correct URL like user and hit enter, I can navigate to the user component. However, if I type incorrect URL, I am redirected to the page not found component. So this is the purpose of wildcard routes. Instead of throwing error, we can redirect that incorrect routes to the page not found component. Okay. So far we have covered the syntax of default routes, the syntax of normal routes, and the syntax of wildcard routes. And also we have understood how to redirect to another component through URL, like here. Now let's explore how to redirect from one component to another when a navbar link is clicked. In normal HTML, we use the href tag to navigate between pages. So let's try this with an example. So instead of this hash symbol, we simply provide the same path name of the respective component that we configured in the routes array. So first I'll provide the user path for this user link. And for data binding, I'll provide the same data binding path from routes array. Similarly, I'll copy paste the structural directive as well as attribute directive. That's it. Now save the changes and let me open browser and click on any link, and you will be redirected to the respective component using href attribute. However, you might notice that the entire page is refreshed during the redirection. Here you can see. If I click on attribute directive, you can see the entire page is reloading. I'll do this one more time and you will see that the page refreshes with every redirection. Okay. But this is not ideal in Angular application because Angular is designed for building single page applications, and single page application is a web application that loads a single HTML page and dynamically updates its content without requiring a full page reload. And what single page application does? In single page application, the server sends the necessary data to the client, and after that, only the required information is fetched from the server as the user interacts with the web page. The page is then dynamically rewritten to reflect the changes. And this is the core principle of single page applications. So now let's resolve the page reloading issue using Angular's router link directive. And to use this directive, first we need to import it inside imports array. So here I'll import router link. And there are four ways to use router link directive. So inside HTML file, we can use this router link directive instead of href. So here we need to write a router link with a lowercase r and an uppercase link. And we need to add the same path name user for this user link. So this is the first way to use router link directive. Now let's understand the second way. Second way is also the same, only the difference is we can use the path name with forward slash like this. And the third way is instead of href, I'll paste router link, and here we can use property binding. So for that we need to wrap this router link inside square bracket. But in this case, we need to bind the path name as a string like this inside single quote. So this is the third way. Now, fourth way. Again, I'll wrap this router link inside square bracket like property binding. And in this fourth method, we can wrap this path name inside square bracket like an array with single quotes. And after this path, we can add parameters like ID, name, status, etc. separated by comma. So in future, if you need to pass such kind of parameters, then you can choose this syntax to use router link directive. Okay, so with these four syntaxes, we can use router link directive in Angular. Now let's test this in the browser. And now kindly notice the refresh icon. Now when I click on this user link, I am redirected to the user component without a page reload. Similarly, clicking on data binding link, again I am redirected to the data binding component. Now I'll click on structural directive and does not refresh the page. So it is indicating that our router link directive is working as expected. Okay, so with this we have achieved routing on link click without page reload. Now let's quickly explore another directive called routerLinkActive directive. And this directive allows us to dynamically add CSS classes to an element when its link route is currently active. For example, currently we are on user component, but it is unclear to the user which link is active in the navbar. So to fix this, we can use the routerLinkActive directive. Okay, so for that, first I'll import the routerLinkActive directive inside imports array. RouterLinkActive, save the changes, and again I'll go inside HTML file, and here I'll assign the active class to the routerLinkActive directive. RouterLinkActive equals to active. Now next, I'll add the CSS for the active class in the SCSS file of same component. So here dot active, and inside this I'll write font weight bold. Okay, and now I'll apply the same directive to the remaining three components here. Save the changes, and here you can see now the current active link is displayed in bold, and when I click on another link, then that link becomes active like this. So it means user can easily understand currently which link is active. So this is how we can make the necessary changes using the routerLinkActive directive. Okay, so that's all for now. And just to recap, we have covered the basics of Angular routing. Especially, we have explored configuring routes, including normal, default, and wildcard routes. Then we explored four different ways to use the router link directive. And finally, the use of router link active directive. And in our next video, we will dive into navigation methods. Okay, so thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to FED Learning for quick and easy learning. Thank you. Bye bye.